Good evening. This is Robert Moynihan with Inside the Vatican magazine, and I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with two young, courageous lawyers from the United States who have established a new office to take on some very difficult cases, which will have a great deal to do with freedom and justice in America in the future. Peter Schofield, Scott Lloyd, welcome.
Thank you for having us, Robert.
Thank you, Robert.
You've got a new office. Where are you located and what are you doing?
So we're in Front Royal, Virginia. That's about 60 miles west of Washington, D.C. And so we're sort of connected to D.C. in terms of some of the work we take on, and but we're also situated in small town America, taking care of local issues as well.
What is the main thrust of this office?
Well, we got our start in 2020. I was leaving the federal government, working in the Trump administration, and I decided to hang my shingle, as they say, and open a law office. And my background was in policy, and a lot of that policy had to do with First Amendment, 14th Amendment issues, constitutional law, and personhood and religious liberty. Some, I would say, administrative procedure act regulations and the executive branch of the government, and then also some government affairs work. And so when I started a law office, I just said to myself, what in the world will anybody hire me to do? Because my work has been so, I mean, it's constitutional law, and I'm conservative leaning, and it's civil rights and everything else. So, and then all these vaccine mandates started happening, and
well, we better be careful. I'm not sure we can talk about these matters. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think that ship has sailed for me at least. But
what do you mean by that?
Oh, I've been talking about it since really before it came on. I was a town councilman starting in 2021, so that's February. And really, I mean, if you really think back to that, we were talking about, I mean, the vaccine was brand new, and I submitted a proposal for a local ordinance that would protect people from unwanted vaccines and medical treatment. And that was when, if you proposed the idea that they were going to try and mandate the COVID vaccine, you were a tin hat person. And I think probably if somebody said something along those lines to me, I think I would have disbelieved them or said, that's a little bit, we're not quite there yet. And
so in other words, you would have said it's impossible in a free country to impose such things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was probably my attitude. I still believe that people wouldn't go down that route in this country.
Okay, but it did occur. And then what did you see? Did you see that there were people who were harmed in some way that needed legal representation?
Yeah, absolutely. So the local hospital system, they started talking like they might mandate something in the early summer of 2021. And then finally they decided to do it. And at that point, we tried to organize protests and strikes and walkouts, and we were successful in people striking and walking out and demonstrating. But yet the hospital system went through with what they were planning and fired a bunch of, excellent workers. I believe it was 300 in total. And
where was all this at that time?
This is in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia.
Okay.
And so a number of those folks became my clients after they were terminated. So we filed cases under either the Title VII of the Title VII is a federal law, or there's a state analog that we've also used to bring claim.
Okay. And what's the injustice that occurred, and how can it be remedied?
Well, at both the federal and state level, employers are duty bound to provide religious accommodations when people need them, and employers have a legal responsibility to work actively to provide those accommodations, and they failed to do so in this case and incurred liability. And the damages that would be available in that circumstance is anything that a person has lost as a result of not receiving that accommodation. And so if they've been out of work for 6 months, then they're entitled to 6 months pay. But also in certain circumstances, there could be punitive damages if the employer knew that they were supposed to extend these accommodations and they didn't do it, then that could lead to punitive damages and also attorney's fees.
So this is a opening of an office to invite people who feel they were suffering for some reason, they were unjustly fired or off, and they suffered economic or other types of damage. And are you thinking of making this a class action suit for the entire country?
Well, yeah, we sort of got it started out not really knowing what was going to come through our door, but I definitely had the background working the pro-life movement, basically standing up for people who didn't have a voice. Once it became clear that this was the direction we were heading, we became known as attorneys who would take on these types of cases. And as for the class actions, that type of relief is available in certain limited circumstances, but we have been filing class actions on behalf of federal employees who lost their job under the same circumstances that I was just describing, except for the federal mandate. And I think at one point we had up to 16 class actions moving through the administrative and federal district court stages.
Okay. We already have a number of viewers watching live with us. Kathleen Tracy from Quebec, Canada. We have Gonzalo Suarez in Sao Paulo, Brazil. We have Colette O'Doherty watching from Ireland. We have Bill Zupancic from the Pacific Northwest, USA. And Kathleen Tracy says there were lots of injection injuries also. So you were speaking of people laid off, there were financial harm. Do you get into the question of whether these medical procedures, I don't know if I should call them vaccines, if these gave any form of harm to people?
Yeah, we do have cases along those lines for vaccine injury. It's interesting. That is a really fascinating world to be a part of, because in 1986, the Congress decided to immunize vaccine makers from immunize. I didn't even mean to use that word, but they decided.
Well, you slipped into it. It shows how.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, they removed any liability for vaccine makers, and then they did something similar for emergency devices in the PrEP Act.
Can I got on that line of injury, prior to 1986, could you sue the maker of some type of medicine or potion or vaccination for some harm, or was that not done prior to 1986?
As far as I know, you were able to do that, and that was one of the problems that they have, because I think it was one of the DTaP vaccinations in the 70s turned out to have all sorts of problems, and it was a similar situation where they saw this disease I don't know, permeating the population. They felt this emergency need to have a vaccine. They developed the vaccine, and then there was all sorts of injuries. And the vaccine manufacturer faced all sorts of liability, and I believe, I don't know, went out of business, or at least that iteration of that company went out of business. And then it was in 1986 where I heard it described as almost a political shakedown, but all of the vaccine makers came together and they said, we're not going to make any more vaccines unless you insulate us from liability for making these. And that's essentially what Congress did with President Reagan's signature, and the Supreme Court has upheld those. And what they did instead was create sort of like the Superfund sites. Every vaccine maker pays into a fund, and if somebody alleges that they have an injury as a result of a vaccine, then they can get compensation out of that fund. The argument among the people who have had to go through those vaccine courts is that the compensation is not commensurate with the injuries, and then there's a separate similar court for emergency products like the COVID vaccines, and that people are alleging has not even really been set up, and they're not even really processing many cases at this point. And so any sort of compensation is years off, at least according to the latest information that we have.
Okay, we do know that some medical procedures or injections or medicines can cause some harm. And one great case, very well-known case, is thalidomide. Thalidomide was given to women who had some problems during their pregnancy, and they were told that this would relieve them of some pain. But the infant was affected and was born with deformations. And eventually that drug was taken entirely off the market. So our interest is in human health, and we could certainly recognize that there may be cases where there might be very dangerous diseases, and there might be a need for everyone to try to do something against the diseases. But we are also interested in the truth. And we want to know, and as you study these matters, are we being told the truth about this pandemic and about the, not just one vaccination, but I think there were 26 or 28 of them. And we never were told which was the best, which was the most effective. Was there real science at each stage of the process here, or are we not allowed to even ask that question? What do you think?
Peter, you want to start? I've been doing a lot of talking.
Oh, okay. Peter Schofield will join the conversation.
You're on mute.
Oh, I'm on mute right now?
No, you're not. You're okay.
You're good now. You're good now.
Okay. So, I was just going to go back to that point real quick, though, Bob. There's the old expression, justice delayed is justice denied.
Yes.
So just to go back just for a second to what Scott was saying is, what's interesting is finding the right venue to file these suits, whether it be the vaccine courts, if it really classifies as a vaccine, whether it's a federal court. There's a lot of different venues, and one of the interesting legal aspects to this is finding the right one and then finding a way to have justice happen in a timely manner, and not something where, oh, the drug's taken off the market years down the road in that previous case that you had mentioned, but that we actually can have something that is tangible and immediate for the clients who are seeking that justice.
Okay. So you've had some cases already and you brought them to court. Can you describe any of those?
Sure. Well, we're bringing most of our cases have to do with Title VII and the religious discrimination angle here. And right now, those cases, with a few exceptions, they've been meeting a lot of resistance at the district court level. And to give you an example of some of the arguments and the lines of reasoning that we're seeing, we have some clients who have argued, for example, they're evangelical Christians, and they say to their, as part of their complaint, that in order to decide whether to take the vaccine, they consulted scripture and they prayed. And once they felt that they had an inspiration from the Holy Spirit, they then made their decision not to take the vaccine. And what we've found some courts saying is that this is not a religious belief that you're describing. And in fact, if we were to treat this as a religious belief, then that could undermine our system of ordered liberty. And so,
Interesting.
And so what we're seeing is a maximalist hostility toward religious belief, and probably some of the most common religious beliefs in the United States. This is at the district court level. We haven't seen this sort of thing just yet at the appellate court level, but it may take the Supreme Court to weigh in on these things before we have some sort of normalcy restored to these claims. But in the meantime, for the most part, we've encountered hostility. We've had some success with especially testing and masking claims. Interestingly, it seems like the employers got their ducks in a row with regard to the vaccine, or enough to survive some of these challenges. But with the testing and masking, they just didn't really implement any sort of religious accommodation process, and they're getting dinged for that, at least at the preliminary level.
Well, the other thing too, just to hop in with that, Bob, is that for a lot of these cases, you have to be within the statute of limitations, and you also have to do a lot of procedural things in order to have a case filed in federal court. And what we've seen in the overwhelming amount of the cases that we have is that the employer, whether the employer was a state actor or a private entity, were not really apprising the employees of what they needed to do in order to file some kind of a grievance or some kind of a complaint. And so oftentimes what we're seeing as well is just on the procedural issues that we really have to kind of work with the clients to make sure that they had done everything properly at a time when they really didn't know what they needed to do in order to preserve their claim to file in federal court. So that's also been a hurdle that we've had.
We're getting a couple of comments now. Someone says, we're thrilled to learn of this. In other words, people don't even realize that there's a legal procedure that possibly could be followed for some injury. And we have someone else saying they always move the goalpost until the right for legal action expires. Also, it takes time for the population to catch up with the reality that COVID-19 was just the flu. Well, that's Kathleen's judgment. I do think we need medical analysis to tell us exactly what it was. I'm not sure we've gotten a consensus on that, because there are various hundreds and hundreds of doctors and scientists who do say that the narrative that was given to us was incomplete. And I think all of us deserve as complete a narrative as possible in every aspect of our public life, as we do as best we can in our private lives. But how could it be that statute of limitations would run out on cases that are only 2-3 years old?
Well, for discrimination cases, the statute of limitations is pretty short, and so that's what we're running into.
Okay. Which is how long usually?
Well, it's between 180 and 300 days. It depends on whether your state has
So if you're arguing discrimination, you really can't bring anything from 2021.
In most cases, there are some limited circumstances where you could bring a late case, but that's where it's the EEOC or your employer that made it difficult for you to bring the case in the first place.
Okay. Well, these are technicalities, but
Yeah.
in general, are you getting people approaching you, say they lost several thousand or tens of thousands of dollars, or their business, or their house? They had to move to look for another job, and they had tens of thousands of costs. Is that are people emerging to make these type of claims?
Yeah, we've had a lot of those people call in where I'm surprised. It's people who have had these jobs for 15, 20 years, 25 years, and they've worked their whole careers to be in this position, all just to be let go because of the COVID-19 vaccine. So we hear all the stories, and again, like you said, Bob, people moving, people having to find a new job, relocate their families, move to different states, and it really is it's a sad thing to see, but we do have a lot of clients that are like that, and I'll kind of let Scott talk a little more in detail about that.
Okay. Well, I mean, what is the religious principle that possibly could lead someone to say, I would prefer not to take the vaccination? Can't it just be a health principle that you want to rely on your own immune system, and before if you're not persuaded that your own danger is as dangerous as people are saying?
Right. Well, so that's an interesting legal issue that you're hitting on, because there's all sorts of religious principles in our Catholic clients. It tends to be essentially the judgment of their conscience is that they can't take it, and the Catechism says that we need to follow our conscience.
What does the U.S. law say about that?
Well, so it's sort of mixed in the same way that we're still waiting for the determination, the final determination. I mean, it may sound hard to believe, but a lot of these cases that began in 2021, they're still at pretty early stages of the litigation, because they had to go through an entire administrative process before they could get into federal court. And that administrative process got so backed up with these cases that it took forever in order to get any sort of resolution. And so what we're hearing from the federal court, I mean, it's mixed on the Catholic beliefs, referencing conscience, but Catholic beliefs or evangelical beliefs referencing abortion, somehow this is something that's familiar to the courts, and they're recognizing that somewhat more readily. But then you have this phenomenon where people who can say that they have a religious belief against the vaccine, they have at least the possibility of getting a religious accommodation. Then there's people who have a medical problem with it, and they might get a medical vaccination. But what you were referencing in your question was essentially a philosophical belief. I don't want to take this vaccine because I don't think it's a good idea, according to not necessarily religion, but according to my right thinking. And so we were talking to a client today, and we're hoping to bring a case on her behalf that
Okay, this is interesting, a very precise case.
Yeah, and so in the circumstance where the state has held out accommodations for religious believers but not non-religious believers, haven't they established violated the Establishment Clause in saying that you must have religious belief in order to obtain this protection? And so that's an angle we're also
interesting angle. Yes,
it is. It's a fascinating case.
What are you discovering really here, though? It's a legal wasteland in a way. We've got a country which prides itself on the freedom of the individual, to maybe not be forced to keep his cell phone next to his ear all day. The government could say, you must keep your cell phone on your pillow. You could say, well, I think that might not be the best thing. I'm not going to do it. Does the government have the right to tell you to do something that you think may be possibly not in your best interest in a free country. And what is our law on this matter?
Well, I think that it depends on what they're telling you to do. You know, they tell you that you have to pay taxes, and in the end, we do have to pay taxes, but it depends on the taxes. It depends on how they get to the conclusion that you have to pay this specific tax. And you know, in the case of cell phone or medical treatment, then they really have to have a hook. They have to have justification, and they have to make sure that they're not trampling on any rights once they make that determination. And I think that that last part is where they really get hung up. I mean, sure, you could tell everybody that they can't gather in groups larger than 10, except that we have the Bill of Rights that says that you have the right to assembly. And so, you know, when you brush up against those rights that we have enshrined, then that's where the government runs into problems. And then, you know, on and on for according to each potential, you know, circumstance. So
Yeah.
Just to piggyback off that too, it's going really back to what Scott said, is these are situations where your fundamental right to bodily integrity that are great. These are the rights that are given to us by the Constitution. So these claims that we're bringing, these are all constitutional claims. At the end of the day, what we're looking at is we're looking back to the idea of fundamental law, which we have all the way from Magna Carta down to our own United States Constitution. And the idea that we have these certain inalienable rights under the Constitution itself is what we're bringing these claims under.
Okay, what is our right to keep our own body and to movement and to not taking something into our body? Is that being safe in our possessions? Or where is that in our Constitution? What is our freedom? You
want to start, or you want me to start, Peter?
I'll let you lead this one off, Scott.
Okay. So they basically, this has been, we're making this argument on behalf of a nurse here in Virginia, and our argument is one that's pretty familiar to a lot of people, at least our core argument, and that is that we have a right to bodily integrity. And that right is best articulated in the case of Missouri versus, or Director versus Cruzan. Cruzan is the shorthand term, and I'm just not quite sure that I have the rest of the title, but Cruzan is the shorthand. I think it's either Missouri or it's the medical director, but it was essentially the health authority in Missouri versus this family who was essentially asking their daughter to be taken off of medical treatment. And in that case, the court said, you know, you can look at our cases and you could say that we have found a fundamental right to refuse unwanted medical treatment. And that is where we get this idea of bodily integrity, and that was one of the principles that was involved in the later abortion cases, Planned Parenthood versus Casey and everything else. It got distorted in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, but in any case, it's what people are thinking when they think of the idea that we can decline medical treatment. There's a state analog, and it has some recognition in our Supreme Court precedent that you know, at the state level, if somebody is trying to give you unwanted medical treatment, then they're trying to batter you. And so in instances where people have been they've received medical treatment, like a surgery that they didn't want, it was a case of mistaken identity, or I think there's a case where a woman went under for a certain procedure and she woke up and she had been sterilized or something along those lines. But basically, if you're receiving unwanted medical treatment, then somebody is battering you. And
Okay,
that's
so it's a battery. It's an aggression against you.
yeah. So this is a principle that you find in state tort law, which is the personal injury, slip and fall, or anything else. It's basically if somebody has hurt you, that legal theory finds its home in state government.
Now,
Then
well, we have to keep pushing here to try to get the whole size of this question, because almost everyone in our society is wondering what happened to us and what was the truth about what happened to us. And two lawyers like yourselves, which I regard you as courageous, are stepping in an area where people have been deplatformed. They've been accused of being dangerous, purveyors of false information. And you're just trying to get facts about what people experienced and if they had damages, how they could be compensated. And what you're finding is you're against an establishment of very powerful forces, big drug companies and big government and big medicine, we might call it. And we do feel, since we are Catholic, that there is a certain reverence that one owes to the legitimate preachers and teachers and priests of the community. And our community in America has given that reverence to the medical profession with the white robes and the stethoscope. And we really trust that they've told us the truth and they've guided us. But there are people out there telling us that there's some corruption has crept in and that big money has crept in. And therefore, we require two young men like yourselves, like David, going up the Goliath against Goliath, who doesn't want any question raised at all. Are you afraid about what you're doing?
Well, like the story of David and Goliath, I mean, what would we have to fear? We're doing what we have to do in faith. And
couldn't you receive some type of pressure by someone somehow calling into question your credentials or finding something, accusing you of something or harassing you in some way, or having your tax returns examined with a fine-tooth comb? You're not afraid of any of that happening?
Well, what we do in faith and trusting that God will help us, and of course using the full extent of our professional abilities to make sure that everything that we're doing is proper, correct, and well done, and adheres to a standard of excellence. But from there, it's in God's hands, and if He sees it as according to His purposes for us to suffer for what we're doing, then blessed be God. But if He has other plans, whatever they are, I'm along for the ride.
All right. May I ask, tell us the location and the address, and give me maybe a contact number, how people can find you on the internet, an email that we could post here.
Yeah, so we're in Front Royal. We're on 15 Chester Street in Front Royal, Virginia. We just got a new website launched, and that is, www.lloydlg.com, and the LG stands for Law Group. That's the name of our firm, is Lloyd Law Group.
Okay, so Lloyd is the sort of founding force, and LloydLG.com. Is that what it is? www.LLOYD.com. Okay, correct?
That's right.
People can find you there and then send you an email.
Yep.
And do you have a phone number, or do you not want to give it out?
No, we're happy to give out our phone number. So yeah, our office number here is 540-823-9792. 1110. And people can contact us that way. If we have a very user-friendly website that we, like I said, we just had kind of finished and revamped. So there's a very easy way to contact and connect with us via our website. And then just kind of going back to where we are here in Front Royal, Virginia, just a little bit of my brief history is, so as Scott had mentioned, he's founded the practice. He started the practice back in 2020 when really everything regarding COVID was happening. And I just joined up with forces with Scott last September. So I'm relatively new to some of the issues and some of the litigation, but I'm quickly getting into it just because we have so many cases that we have here. And then my background previous to coming and joining up with Scott was I worked for 4 years for the Department of Justice in the Constitutional Torts Branch.
So you were inside the government, as it were. You're an insider in the Beltway.
Yep, that's right. That's right. And then I found this small Catholic law firm in Front Royal, Virginia, and then I had known about Scott because we both attend the same parish here in Front Royal. So I had known about Scott for a while and I'd seen him at different events, but I didn't really know all of the litigation that he was getting into at the time. So
okay, and you are how old are you, may I ask? Peter?
I'm 36.
36, and you have a family?
Family of seven.
Seven
kids. Yep.
And so you're rolling the dice here with this law firm, and you're working night and day on these questions of justice with regard to medical overreach. Correct?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. And then, Scott, you're quite a famous person. I found you on the internet. I wondered if you can summarize what you're famous for.
It's always funny to hear that about yourself, and it's not something to get used to.
Well, I like it that you say that, because having taken difficult stands and principled stands, you've been attacked, but you remain quite humble and steadfast. And we have a reader, Mare Glynn, writing, "I feel hope listening to this. Well done, and God bless and protect you both in your work."
Thank you.
So, Scott, tell us something about what you passed through.
That's really humbling comment. But so in the as a appointee for the Trump administration, I was asked to oversee shelters for minors who were here without legal status, and we have
In Texas.
Well, they're all over the country. Most of them are in Texas, but yeah, and this program, it pops up sort of randomly when there's something going wrong in the program. It comes up every once in a while. And it becomes a news item, and then it goes away, and everybody forgets about it. But it's there, and at any one time, we could have tens of thousands of kids in federal custody. And
just to confirm that, these are people who came over the border. They're younger than 18 and maybe much younger. And there's tens of thousands with no parents.
Right. And I mean, we could do a podcast on this on its own, but it's the type of thing that's started out to address emergency situations that happen maybe a few hundred or maybe a few thousand times a year. It really started with children who were arriving unaccompanied in shipping containers from China, and then they were having to go through INS without any really sort of parents or legal guardians. And so the federal government was trying to solve that problem and take a human services approach rather than a law enforcement approach. And then the smuggling companies and all the worst types of people down south of the border got wind of this program, and they started essentially selling a package that would allow kids to come across by themselves in order to avail themselves of this program. And so what began as case a few hundred a year became something it's gone beyond 60,000 cases a year.
I can hardly believe what you're saying, but I'd like to get the truth from you. There
Yeah.
were containers coming largely from China, you're saying, and would be 10 or 20 children inside a container? And how would they?
No. So these were like one or two isolated incidents of children who, in order to escape China, smuggled themselves out of China in a shipping container. And this is an isolated incident. And I guess I'm too young to remember, but I guess this was big enough news that Dianne Feinstein grabbed onto this issue and created this program.
Okay, so maybe just have been one or two or three cases.
Yeah. So just to be clear, that was there were two isolated incidents, but it's created this program that's metastasized.
So the government, to deal with a couple dozen kids, then created a children's services or youth services procedure to try to help these kids. And then the Mexican, what are they called? Drug lords started somehow sending young people, I mean, many I suppose are teenagers, but started sending them in knowing that they would be picked up not by any type of justice or authority that would arrest them or return them, but they would immediately introduce them to this other youth services. And this became now many, many thousands. You're saying tens of thousands.
Yeah. And so they're sent across the border by the smugglers with instructions to present themselves to Border Patrol, and Border Patrol, as quickly as possible, hands it over to the program that I ran.
You were running the whole program.
Yeah. So there's a director who runs it, and yes.
And what happened to you?
Well, we got some requests from some of these minors to get abortions, or for the federal government to provide abortions, and so we had to determine whether there was any legal obligation for us to do so, and we discovered that there wasn't. And so, on a case-by-case basis, we analyzed the circumstance, and then came to a determination. And the determination, I mean, it was a pro-life administration, but the determination was going to tend to be no. And we had one case that went to litigation over it, and basically there was a determination by a district court that it was necessary for us to take the child for an abortion. And then another case came up, and I think probably the expectation was that we wouldn't oppose it, but we refused to take that child as well. And then a third, and then a fourth case. And so there are several cases going on at the same time with the ACLU and allies litigating against the Trump administration. And what they tried to do as a result was make me uncomfortable enough to want to leave the government by taking out ads in Politico and some of the other journals and everything else, and even the hometown newspaper. And we had journalists showing up to our house before dawn to catch me on my way to work.
You have a family?
I have a family, yeah.
And people were showing up before dawn at your house? And
yeah, journalists.
What were the posters or the advertisements saying?
Scott Lloyd is an awful person. They hired a billboard truck to drive around the Department of Health and Human Services and follow the new HHS secretary to his first hearing. And the billboard was saying, "Fire Scott Lloyd." And I have a picture of it, and I tried to get a picture of myself in front of the truck. But in any case, I mean, yeah, so it was just
But were you fired?
No, I didn't quit, and they didn't fire me, but the pressure continued. And over time, I was offered another position in the department, and that happened to coincide with the Democrats retaking the House, and basically the writing on the writing was on the wall there. So I took the position, and it turned out to be exactly what it looked like it was.
Well, Scott, I'm sorry that you passed through all of this. It strikes me so many of us don't realize the conditions in which millions of people live. And these young women, I'm assuming teenagers between 13 and 18, because they're minors, are pregnant. The children, in some circumstance, in another world, would have been cherished and would have been brought joyfully to life. But these situations of migrants and drug lords sending them, all of this is so sad to hear. And you, of course, are pro-life, but you, for your pro-life work, were vilified as someone who didn't care for these children. And so then we move on to the legal situation. I divide these last few years into 2020. We started to hear the first Chinese falling over in about late January, early February, and the ships had the disease, the cruise ships. But there was always odd things about the news we were hearing, and who was in danger and who could be infected and how dangerous it might be and how old. If you were old, you might be in difficulty, but if you were young, you might not have any real problem. And then suddenly that whole year goes by with all the restrictions, and we have to stay at home, and we didn't have any question of vaccination. That came in 2021. And that whole year this is the answer to what seemed to have been dominating 2020. And yet people felt that they had passed through all of 2020, were still in good health. And they felt, as they examined the situation, I'm taking a walk, I'm eating probiotic food, I'm getting my rest, I'm getting sunshine. But all the rules were told, stay in your house, don't walk, close off the parks. So there were contradictory medical signs. And out here and there in the medical world, there'd be these odd doctors like Dr. Robert Malone, who I went to talk to because he also lives in Virginia. And all these people were saying there's a whole backstory to all of this, decades of work on a type of procedure which changes a little bit your genetic code, mRNA. And we've never gotten the full truth on these matters. But we went through 2021, and then suddenly 2022, we get, unfortunately, the terrible war in Ukraine. And so we start to lead up to the question of, will Russia and America fight a nuclear war? Starts with this flickering development in eastern Ukraine, and now we're right on the edge. And 2023 is this past year, and you're trying to continue to fight for clarity and justice for people you feel were suffering greatly due to the decisions taken. And I just want to go further now. Are you allying with other lawyers anywhere?
Yeah. There are a number of groups. So we've had really some success with some friendly lawyers at Boyd and Gray and Associates. They were actually the ones who were litigating some of the work on behalf of our clients that we were supporting as general counsel. And then, but beyond that, there are some advocacy groups that you see out there who are dialed in on this issue. But we've attended some conferences that are focused on these issues exclusively, and we found that a lot of them are really just small firms and independent firms And I think that the reason for that is just there's the larger firms, if they've got a large corporate client, they don't want to get crossways with them. And so they're afraid of this type of work for business reasons.
Hmm.
And I guess in some ways that's understandable. But that's why so many times we've heard people come to us and they're just saying there are no lawyers who will take their case.
Okay. Well, that's why I wanted to have you on. I wanted to understand what you think now, your next few months, in the next year, the next 2 years. One person watching us said they're worried about a possible new virus, which would then be followed by new lockdowns and then some other new vaccination of some sort. And what is our right to maintain our ability not to accept something? And of course, each of us recognizes we want to share whatever burden is necessary to try to keep our neighbors healthy. But are we persuaded that this really is the measure? So are you in this battle in some way? And is what happens in the future related to your success?
Well, I think it's related to our success or the success of cases like ours. And I think the stakes really are pretty high because if something like this comes along, right now when we're litigating, what we're getting in response is Jacobson is a huge case.
What's Jacobson?
Jacobson is a case that said in the context of the smallpox vaccine in 1905, there was a gentleman who didn't want to take the smallpox vaccine, and he litigated over it, and the Supreme Court found that the state of Massachusetts can pass laws requiring that a person take a vaccine. And in punishment, he had to pay the equivalent of about $125, and that was the end of it. But he was saying, I shouldn't be fined for just not taking a vaccine. Well, as we're litigating these cases, what we're getting in response is this court case. Well, that was from 1905.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
if you really think of all of the, women couldn't vote in 1905. There was no such thing as Roe versus Wade. There was no such thing as, now I'm blanking on the case that overturned it, but there was no civil rights movement. Jim Crow was still in place. Women couldn't be lawyers, and since then, all these societal changes have happened. So, does this legal precedent still apply? Now, if the answer is yes, then now we have confirmation and case law dating from 2024 or 2025 that the government can tell you that you have to take a vaccine, and it doesn't even have to be fully FDA approved. But what we're seeing recently is there's at least some hope that the courts aren't going to take Jacobson as precedent. The Ninth Circuit, they distinguished Jacobson along the idea that what we're calling a vaccine doesn't work like the vaccines that were at issue in Jacobson. They are symptom reducers at best, but they're not stopping the disease from spreading. And so,
and that's agreed upon now by the scientists.
Well, you ask an important question, because what the Ninth Circuit really said, and the Ninth Circuit really oversees federal cases in a few states, California, Oregon, Washington, but I may be missing one or two, but those. So at least on a regional basis, what they're saying is that this party is arguing that they are not vaccines in the traditional sense. And for the purpose of this litigation continuing, we are willing to and in some ways are bound to accept that argument just in order to get to the place where that party can start trying to prove that. And so it's not necessarily the case that the courts are accepting, an alternate idea of what constitutes a vaccine. It's more the case that the courts are now willing, the courts are demonstrating that they're now willing to at least hear the case and look at the evidence.
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that each of us, all of us have children. We wouldn't want our children to die, and we would like medicine to be as helpful as possible. Of course we do. And all of us need to have accurate data given to us about whether something could be helpful or harmful to our children. And all of the society wants that. But what we're afraid is that money comes in between this determination, and someone for 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million will alter their judgment and maybe support something that's not so good or not support something that's better. So you're against corruption, really. And you're calling for true health care. You're not calling for us not to be careful about the health of our children and all of us. Now, the World Health Organization has tried to have a treaty now that when they determine certain things, it would override the national government laws. And this is Kathleen Tracy, who says they will override national sovereignty. I had that on the screen. And then she also refers to the shooting of the prime minister in Slovakia recently, Fico, who didn't die, but he was the prime minister of the country, and he didn't want Slovakia to sign the World Health Organization treaty, which would agree that when they come to a determination on the next pandemic, every nation will have to agree whatever they decide. He didn't want to sign that, and he was not going to sign it, and he was shot. We don't know for sure that those two things are connected, but the person who shot him, I don't know that we understand fully his motivation. But she's writing that there was a lot of muscle behind this desire to have a global treaty that would override national laws on these matters. Is this of interest to you?
That particular thing hasn't figured in directly into any of our cases, that treaty, not at this point. But very generally, I mean, anything that weakens our national sovereignty, I mean, I know that I oppose it and would oppose it with any legal tools that I had available to me.
All right. Well, I regard the two of you as fighters for freedom under the laws of the United States of America and under our Constitution. So I applaud what you're doing, and I encourage people to reach out to you and contact you. And I'd like to have you on again as you carry forward on a very noble task and try to bring clarity and justice in very many cases in where people were trampled upon in these past 3 or 4 years. Do you have our time is running out. That's why I'm trying to sum up here. I'd invite any reader, any watcher to comment here. We could maybe get time for one more comment or answer a question. You want to summarize then what you're intending to do and how you think you're going to proceed forward?
Go ahead, Peter, and I'll wrap up.
I think what we're looking to do is to continue filing the litigation that we've already filed and to have those advance further, now getting into later stages of the litigation. And in the meantime, we've also been really connected with a lot of great expert witnesses who are coming in, because as Scott had mentioned earlier, these cases are really fact specific, and they really require excellent medical experts to come in and help us with some of these issues. And so as we kind of continue to gain clarity with the cases that we're working on, we're hopeful that the federal courts will also be unified on how they're going to rule with this, because right now the big problem is that within different circuits, the courts are torn and they rule pretty drastically differently. And then I guess the last thing would just be to say, I'm hopeful that the Ninth Circuit, with now looking into allowing people to look into more of the science behind what was actually in the COVID-19 vaccines, that will bring a lot of truth to light, and that will be a very powerful tool when we're able to actually go into the details of the science behind these COVID-19 vaccines. So I think that's the goal of what we're trying to do, is continue to pursue our cases, and then to have more clarity come about by pursuing those cases and seeing how the courts rule as time goes on.
All right. You did the night you opened your office, someone there said there is a case where if a judge rules a certain way, it'll set a precedent that will be positive for you. Do you recall anything like that? I heard that, I overheard that. Is there anything that could break the logjam here and create a precedent more in favor of what you are arguing for the liberty of people?
Well, I think that I don't recall that specific case, but so many of the cases that were sort of working right now, they really remain at early stages, and we have really the first step isn't complete yet. So really over the next year, but I would say probably in the next 2 or 3 years, probably. We're going to gain greater clarity on these specific issues, and what's going to happen is that they're going to go up to the district court level, and then the appellate court level, and then finally up to the Supreme Court, at least potentially. And so I think that that's probably a process that we'd be lucky to have some sort of clarity on within the next year. I think probably it's going to be another 2 or 3 years.
Okay, and then I would like to bring it back to the faith. Does your faith give you support and clarity as you work on this matter? What does the faith bring to this?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really this is the backbone of our firm and the work that we do here. We try to be as peripheral as we can. As Scott mentioned earlier, we're held to our faith really informs us to hold ourselves at a high standard, and to seek that professional excellence. So as long as we're praying, as long as we're working, and we're diligent about both of those things, as Scott had mentioned earlier, I just don't see anywhere but forward from there. So that's really where we've been seeing the results in our cases. Again, still at early stages of litigation, but I think we're going to see some really good results for our clients.
Yeah.
Okay.
Our shared faith in Christ is absolutely essential to everything that we do here, and I'm happy that we're able to incorporate that explicitly into our daily work through prayer. But absolutely, that's the reason we're doing what we're doing, and the way that we're able to sustain it.
Okay, Scott, thank you so much. We just had a remark on the screen. Gonzalo from Brazil. Thank you for your work, he says. So you've got a few friends around the world who have appreciated this introduction to what you're doing for the freedom of people everywhere, and in the end, for the truth about all these things that we have passed through. Thank you so much for your testimony, your witness, and the work you're doing. See you on a future occasion.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Robert.